Identifying the dead. As rescue efforts in Türkiye turn to recovery, the grim process of identifying victims continues. Special police units and forensic scientists are now contacting surviving family members to deliver the news that no one wants to hear. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is identifying earthquake victims. More than 42,000 deaths have been confirmed from the twin earthquakes in southern Türkiye. Major tremors that followed the February 6th disaster raised the death toll even further, with well over 100,000 people injured as well. But the number of missing people is still being established. As the rescue phase comes to a close, the painstaking task of recovery begins. Identification of victims is part of that phase. And in a disaster of this magnitude, the process is long and complicated. But the importance of it cannot be underestimated. It gives families closure and the chance to say goodbye to their loved ones. Basil Reyhan found out what's involved.
Here in southern Türkiye, workers are clearing the wreckage of what was once someone's home. Onlookers wait for any word about their missing relatives. Sadly, this site is past the point of search and rescue. It's a recovery operation, the grim work of retrieving the dead. Türkiye's death toll from 3 powerful earthquakes has reached more than 40,000. That figure is expected to rise. Cemeteries have been overwhelmed in the days and weeks following the initial disaster.
A body can't wait too long to be buried. If a family doesn't appear, or sometimes the entire family died, and there's nobody to take the body, we become one's family.
As rescue efforts end in many areas, more attention is turning to the deceased. Volunteers carefully catalog bodies, noting where they were found, their age, and gender. Forensic investigators will use the data in cases where a victim's identity is unclear.
Some of the people we receive are unidentified, especially refugees from Syria. Often it's impossible to identify their bodies.
Disaster victim identification, or DVI, is a critical stage of the emergency response. Türkiye has its own DVI response system. In cases when a country needs assistance, it turns to the global standard setter, the international policing organization known as Interpol. The process begins once investigators confirm the names of the missing.
The biggest challenges to me is to get the reliable list of the missing person. Once we have this reliable list of the missing, we reach out to the families or the loved ones and do the family interviews. We want to have primary identifiers such as DNA samples of the missing, fingerprints, and dental records.
Investigators also look for secondary identifiers like scars, tattoos, and jewelry. Once the primary data is collected, the unidentified bodies are exhumed by forensic teams.
We try to get the same primary identifiers, secondary identifiers from the human remains. And this is done by specialized teams from the police. And once you have collected all those, we call it antemortem and postmortem data, we start a reconciliation process, which is kind of an investigation. We investigate possible matches from the AM and PM data.
The DVI investigation in Thailand that followed the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami took more than a year to complete. Thailand's death toll was just over 4,800, with 4,500 missing. The task ahead for Turkish forensic investigators appears to be enormous. In Türkiye alone, around 13 million people lived in the affected areas, including at least 2 million Syrian refugees. Nearly 25,000 buildings have either collapsed or been badly damaged.
In other disasters like a plane crash, usually we deploy immediately after the crash because we have the list of the missing persons through the manifest and we can start working on them straight away. After the earthquake, it's different because, as you know, the conditions are really difficult. The roads are destroyed. There may be less water supply, and this is first of all now a rescue mission.
A third powerful earthquake on Monday has prompted renewed search and rescue operations. That effort now coincides with work to identify the dead. providing closure to family and friends, giving survivors the space to begin the process of grief and healing. Basil Rahan, TRT World.
Well, the process of identifying bodies to find that closure can take years in a case of this scale. So joining me now to discuss what authorities, scientists, and victims are up against are, from Jeddah, Durmus Aydin, Secretary General of IHH, Türkiye's Humanitarian Relief Foundation. From Melbourne, Australia, David Ranson, a Deputy Director at the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine. And from Nottingham, UK, Jay Silverstein, Senior Lecturer at the Chemistry and Forensics Institute at Nottingham Trent University. Thanks all so much for being with us. Durmus, I'll begin with you because you've seen the recovery operation firsthand. There are thousands and thousands of bodies still to be identified. You've seen the aftermath of many different types of disasters before. How would you describe what you're seeing now in southern Turkey?
And thank you very much for having me. It is totally different because it is the area of the earthquake is so wide. And we are not just talking about the one specific area, we are talking about the 10 provinces. So I'm talking about the thousands of demolished houses and collapsed houses. So it's really going to take time to reach some bodies and then identify them. It's really hard, and the officials and the others that they're working very hard to identify. And now the permission of APA, they start to take the rebels by the missionaries at the moment, and it's going to take time, of course.
Okay, so even with all your experience, all the disaster zones you've seen, this stands out. It's above and beyond.
Absolutely, it is something beyond. It's really unimaginable. And when you've been there, in all our research and rescue workers and our humanitarian workers, they are really, horrified and surprised that the huge of the demolition and the area and the houses. It is beyond the imaginations, and it's shocking.
David Ranson, as a forensic scientist yourself, knowing this work so intimately that's being engaged in now, but also observing this case from afar as you are, what are your thoughts for your contemporaries in the field right now doing this work? What are they up against?
Well, there's several challenges they face. One is actually looking after the deceased once they've been recovered, before the processes of identification at a forensic level could be carried out. And that care for the dead and support for their families and loved ones is an incredibly important part of any response that is made. It's a real challenge to work out how are we going to deal with such a large number of individuals. In some ways, it's somewhat similar to some of the issues that occurred across the Balkan crisis. But of course, that warfare took place over a longer period of time, and the recovery took many, many years.
Right. Describe, when you say looking after the deceased and the challenges, specifically in that, what does that entail? What does it mean to have to, what are the logistics and the actual physical mechanisms you need to take care of these recovered bodies?
Yes, certainly. Obviously, where you recover remains, quite often you have to set up what is called a temporary mortuary at the site where the recovery takes place. And here we're talking about many, many sites over a very wide geographical area. This allows people to be collected together, the bodies to be properly contained, numbers allocated, key staff who recover the bodies identified, and the records process starting, because these records are going to be crucial. But unless you've got freezer facilities, unless you've got refrigeration facilities, where you're dealing with very, very large numbers of dead, particularly where there's perhaps been a delay in their recovery leading to a decomposition, and I know temperatures mean that is perhaps not as a great an issue at the moment, but it will become an issue. And as such, the longer it takes to get deceased people to the identification centers and the centers where you can carry out the forensic work, the worse this will be. And sometimes it's been necessary to literally to actually bury people close to the scene in order that they can be recovered later. These are all options that need to be looked at and actually considered as part of the process.
There's so much complexity. Jay Silverstein, I'd like you to also walk us through some of what you see as the biggest challenges that people and workers are facing now in this specific case, starting from the sheer number of victims still being recovered to the logistics of storage and burial that David was just talking about.
Yeah, no, just expounding on what he was saying is that it's really trying to impose some sort of order in physical and emotional chaos. And so the idea of having to try to systematically record the data that you need, to collect the DNA samples, the photographs, the fingerprints, and process the remains in a way that is, with efficiency, but with mind to the emotional stress that the people who are suffering from this are undergoing. So it's extremely important to have an administrative structure that takes all of these things into account.
I have to ask you, as you mentioned, go ahead, David.
So I was just going to say, I think it's really important, this management, not just of the deceased, but of their families and friends and their loved ones, is a crucial part of it. And at the same time, we have to remember that the people who are working, who are recovering these individuals, who are caring for the body, are also at risk of really what is an incredibly emotional challenge for them.
That is exactly what I was going to ask. I mean, Jay, if you want to comment on that, I mean, are the people doing this identification work now, I was going to say, are they used to this? Or will there be a psychological effect on many of them? Because, again, the scale of this disaster, the sheer numbers that they're up against, and the detail in this kind of work, whereby so many people might have to stay unidentified.
Yeah, from my experience, I would say both those things are true, is that people are able to go in as professionals. They're scientists often, or emergency response people, and they deal with things in a very professional level. That doesn't mean that they're not impacted by it. They repress that, and so it may come up, as soon as they have a break, as soon as they get redeployed from being on the scene, or it may come up years later as things get triggered. So there's a traumatic stress that you are exposed to and that you carry, perhaps for the rest of your life when you're in an event like that, not just for the victims, but for the responders.
Right. Durmus, when we talk about the potentially now, we're looking at potentially tens of thousands of undocumented people in this disaster and these bodies that will be found. And we heard an imam actually in the report that we played. We heard this imam dealing with some of the burials say it's actually impossible to identify many of them. Is it impossible?
I don't know how the imam is describing this. Is it impossible because of the damages of the body, or it's impossible for other reasons? But to me, it is possible to identify as long as they can reach the body, and then they can protect the body as long as if they do that. And if the body, they have the relatives and they have the identification who can take the samples or DNA on others, it is likely possible.
So what the imam was actually referring to is the fact that there haven't been claims made on certain bodies that have been recovered, and that they haven't received even identification of these people in certain buildings that have fallen to know whether they were actually there or not. Let me give you an example then. If you have a family in Syria, for example, who knows that a loved one perished in the quake, as an undocumented person, what recourse do they have? What can they do to try and find their loved ones?
Normally, what's going to happen in Turkey, as I know, each and every refugees or temporary protected people who are Syrians, they have their own identification. So if the identification is occurred when the earthquake happened on the body, so they can put somewhere and protect the body and then do the other issues of DNA and others. But if they cannot find the relatives, or if they cannot find any document related to that body, I can't say anything because it is time of period that the body will be buried under the authorities' permission.
Okay. David, let me ask you. Go ahead. Yeah.
So there's another issue here, and it's cropped up in a number of very, very major disasters, and that is the occasions where entire families have actually been killed, and there is simply no one to actually provide that background or even to seek the dead person. Yeah. And then it comes back to the state and the broader community to say, what do we want in this situation? What do we want in terms of identification, or, if you like, humanitarian and dignity in disposal of the dead in that situation? And that issue of dignity, I think, is incredibly important.
Jay, I imagine you agree there. Let me ask you a question, though, along a separate vein. For those doing the forensic science now on the ground, is this work actually dangerous for them, handling these bodies, especially if they have been decaying for a matter of time now? Is there a risk of infection or disease that these workers bear?
Yeah, I don't think, because we've developed the science, and usually people have the appropriate protective equipment. They're knowledgeable about any risks. That I don't think that poses a significant problem in this sort of case.
That's good to hear. I mean, tell us then just how advanced is the science now? And I mean, how little do you actually need today, compared to even a decade ago or 2 decades ago, to identify a human?
Well, there's a number of different levels where it can happen at. Of course, the best method is for someone to know the person and recognize the person, identify the body, assuming that the preservation is adequate. Failing that, then we have a number of options, including fingerprints, dental comparison, and then of course genetic DNA analysis. But in these cases, you usually need some sort of reference sample. You need something to compare to, and as was brought up before, you need a record of who's missing to know what comparative data. So the post-disaster administrative aspect or research aspect and archival aspect of making sure you can put the location of body was recovered from with the biological data of that person with the missing database, and then you put it together to make the identification. So
yeah. Jake, if I just say one thing there, I completely understand the issue of visual identification. It's been my experience, however, that some families are so desperate to find a loved one, they will often misidentify. So my view is I understand what you're saying, and I agree, but I think we do need to apply some level of science to that process, whether it be a primary identifier, dental, DNA, fingerprints, and secondary identifiers as necessary. The more you can collect, and I think you made a very good point about having the right data systems and administrative systems, the more you can collect, the more reliable. And there's nothing more distressing for a family to have identified someone in their own mind, only to find that it was a misidentification for all kinds of reasons.
Right. Durmus, as a humanitarian worker, I mean, how do you balance the kind of emotional needs of the survivors with the science that needs to go into properly identifying the bodies that are recovered?
Yeah. The balance in the emotion is not easy, really, because now when we look at the earthquake, we're talking about thousands of people, and the people are so sensitive, and they lost, for instance, in one family, they lost 20 or 15 members of the family. So the sensitiveness and the emotion is so high, and it is really having difficulties to make the balance. That's why, in their side, the psychosocial support is very crucial for the families of the victims. So it is the matter of the psychosocial support is the level of that, and then the other supports should be carried out separately.
Durmus, also tell us a little bit about what religious considerations are going into the process here. Compare it, if you can, to a place like, post-earthquake Italy, where you can take, weeks to properly bury a body according to the religious needs of a community there. With this region, the survivors prefer that their loved ones are buried within a 24-hour period. How do you deal with that in a case of this scale, with this many identifications need to be made, but also, again, taking in the consideration of the emotional needs of these survivors?
Yeah, in our religious perspective, the Islamic religious view, that when the person has passed away because it's an earthquake or other reasons, we prefer to bury them as early as possible. So the problem is, when it takes time to bury your relatives or loved ones, like 2 days, 3 days, 1 week, now the emotion and the stress is getting very high, and it's causing the other problems with the authorities and the people who are victimized because of the earthquake. So it is very stressful, and it's very hard to make the balance between the victim's family and the authorities as well.
And David, as a scientist, how do you deal with that in the field?
Yes, I think it's extremely difficult. There's this issue of trying to support families to allow them to be connected together with what's going on. At the same time, allowing the space for the scientists and the forensic people to do their job. And there is sometimes a genuine conflict between that. I think one of the important things is to make sure that the families and friends actually have someone in an official capacity who's there as their support representative. That can be done in a group fashion or whatever, but because they then can act as the interface between the family's needs, cultural, religious needs, and the scientists' needs, because they simply want to get on with the job as best they can and as fast as they can.
Jay, let me ask you, as far as what is needed technologically and logistically in the field right now for the people doing this work, what kind of technical donations are being looked for at present in order to get this kind of work done as efficiently as possible?
Yeah, just looking at what I've seen on the response, of course, the primary phase, the first phase is rescue, and that's your priority, is to get as many people out alive as you can. And I saw that teams with dogs who can sniff out remains, heavy equipment coming in, seismic sensing equipment to do everything possible to find the survivor. So that's your first rush of material, and you want an international effort to move that as quickly and efficiently to the scene as possible. Then, as David had brought up, was this setting up of the temporary mortuary. You have to process the remains as they're coming, and you have to balance that with very real cultural and religious ideas of how the remains should be treated. And that does lead to there's a contradiction between what science demands and what culture and religion demand, and so trying to find that compromise. And it may be all you can do at first is assign a number to a set of remains and bury them with the ability to go back to collect evidence later.
Right, David, you mentioned. Yeah, David, you'd mentioned that as well, and I have to bring up what Jay was saying about what science demands and also what the supply actually is. This is very detailed work that requires forensic scientists, of which there's not an oversupply of people that can do this work. So, how much are doctors like you in demand?
We're in a great deal of demand when an incident occurs, and the challenge we all have is that we all have our day jobs, if you like, doing our routine work all the time. When a disaster comes up, we try to coordinate those responses, get teams together, and it's really important that you rotate those teams as well. You can't just leave someone in the field for months. You've got to bring them back, debrief them, get the equipment out for them, and so on. So this is not something that just happens over a short period. It happens over initially some activity for weeks and months of high activity, and then things slow down and you start having these same things but now spread over many months. And weather conditions can have a big part to play. In MH17, for example, the issue was, of course, once winter hit, then recovery of remains and scattered under snow and so on became almost impossible. So these are really important things for long-term logistic planning. And the Balkans were another good example of that. This was an identification process that took years.
Right.
What is happening these days is that many of the agencies who are involved in training and so on are changing their approach. We'll never have enough forensic pathologists and anthropologists to go out there and do this work. What we need to do is train the communities to do those first stages. As Jay said, getting the number, getting the remains, have some data collected from them initially, and then the ability to go back months or years later is preserved.
Durmus, very quickly, I want to finish with you. Tell us, as a humanitarian worker, what you are preparing survivors for, on how long you think this could actually take before they will get the closure they're looking for.
Yeah, it is really very hard to answer because, you know, you're talking about this is a huge traumatized community and population. It's going to take time, as the expert says, in many years. It's not just about the forensic way, it's also about the psychosocial traumatic issues, not just the victimized of the earthquake, also indirectly victimized of the earthquake of people. It's going to take years and years.
Okay, Durmus Aydin, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.